I'm now going to be joined by Esther Duflo. Esther is the Abdul Latif Jameel Professor of Poverty, Alleviation and Development Economics at MIT. She's also a co-founder and co-director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab. Last year, as Colin mentioned, Esther became the youngest person at age 46 and the second ever female winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. She was awarded jointly with Abhijit Banerjee, her husband, and Michael Kremer for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. Today we're going to explore the impact of coronavirus on global poverty and what we can learn from the work of Esther and her colleagues to create policies that will help create a better life for the world's most vulnerable. Hello Esther, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. You're joining us today from Boston. How are things for you there at this time?
Things are good. Thank you very much. We're definitely the fortunate ones, still having job and nice house to spend the lockdown in.
Absolutely. So Esther, you and your fellow economists work on poverty alleviation in developing countries. And we're going to explore, as I mentioned, a little bit what coronavirus means for those countries and what we can learn from your work, which essentially explores how to help create a better life for people in those countries. Yesterday, we heard from Lakshmi Shyam-Sunder, the Chief Risk Officer of the World Bank, and the World Bank has said that almost 24 million fewer people in 2020 will escape poverty across East Asia and the Pacific alone due to the economic impact of this pandemic. Lakshmi was talking about how even more difficult the World Bank's job is becoming in helping to alleviate poverty in these countries. What's your take on the state of this now compared to when you were doing your work for which you won the Nobel Prize? And what do you think the response of the governments in those countries, the developing nations, has been to this crisis, both from a health perspective and a fiscal perspective?
Thank you very much for this important question. This is, we have to step back one step and realize that this is coming after 3 quite good decades for the world's poor, where the number of people living in extreme poverty had been halved, infant mortality and maternal mortality have been halved as well. Almost every child is now in school, at least at the primary school age. So, and absent this coronavirus crisis or another big crisis, one could have expected this type of progress to continue. At the same time, I think this is clearly a wake-up call for us that the poor remain extremely vulnerable to economic crisis, climate crisis, health crisis. And the reason why people fall back into poverty when there is something like the coronavirus is because the worldwide economic crisis, which rich countries are able to mostly protect their citizens against, hit directly the poorest people. There is not the same level of social protection system that's available to continue to support people as the economy is going into full lockdown. These countries are suffering from the slowdown in production, in tourism, in travel, etc. And that again affects people directly. And there is very little that can be done. Countries have much less scope to weather those uncertainty in those difficult times.
So we heard this morning a conversation around globalization or deglobalization or the changing nature of globalization. It seems that poorer countries can be both the beneficiaries of globalization but also directly impacted by globalization. Do you have a view on whether or not globalization is actually a good thing for developing countries and what the future of globalization is, whether or not we will go to more regionalisation, which our audience thinks that we might, and whether or not that will exacerbate the divide between the rich and the poor countries?
So most economists are very much trained in thinking that globalization is a good thing for the poor in the poor countries because there is a lot of, because those countries are abundant in labor, and therefore when we have globalization, they will be able to sell to the west or to the north the goods that they are particularly good at producing. In practice, when we look at the data and the experience of globalization across many countries, it is not that obvious that it has been particularly good for the poor. I think it has been good for those countries in general. I was mentioning the reduction in poverty. A big part of it is a big decline in poverty in China and India. And it is clear that that has happened in part as a result of the integration of those two large economies in the worldwide economy. But within those countries, inequalities have tended to go up as those countries got integrated in the market, very much like in rich countries, and contrary to what you might have expected. The other point is that not every poor country has been able to take a place in this globalization. And this is very much because of the fast and very successful growth of China, which in a sense has cornered the market for many of the production of labor-intensive goods in the economy. So now if you have a country, even like Ethiopia, for example, which has a lot of going for it, in order for Ethiopia to kind of become a big player in the international market, someone has to trust them enough to switch from their China producer to an Ethiopia producer. And if you are Kenya, for example, and you've never produced that type of good, then it's even harder. So Kenya took years to develop one excellent supply chain in flowers. And if Kenya wanted to go into ball bearings, that would take them a very, very long time, not because they don't have the ability to do it, but because they don't have a reputation, and everybody prefers to stick to what they know. Which brings me to the current situation. Something that I don't see discussed much is not so much regionalization and deglobalization as much as a spread of the supply chain across different countries. Because if anything, what we've learned is that it's very risky to rely on all the production coming from China, or even not from China, but from one town in China that happens to be the town where everybody produces knitwear. What if there is a Wuhan-style lockdown in this knitwear town, and I know the entire world doesn't have underwears anymore? So of course, underwear is a final good, so that's fine, people will do without. But if it's ball bearing that are specific to your industry, your entire operations have to stop. So it seems to me that what we will realize when people come back to their senses and go out of the panic is not that we need to re-regionalize, but that we need to spread the global supply chain to more countries. And this could actually be an opportunity for many developing countries that have been shut down from the opportunity to participate in world trade because they don't have a reputation. But it's not going to happen without some collective effort, either by governments or by international institutions or even by trade associations. Because it is not the interest of any particular firm to do it. Any particular firm would like to continue to work with their trusted provider, but it is the interest of the entire sector, because should something happen to that trusted provider, there would be someone else to turn to. So it's an investment and developing the capabilities and also the reputation and letting the other poor countries try out their space in this global marketplace is something that would have huge positive externalities on the entire corporate sectors. So one would hope and that this is what's going to happen moving forward. And I think I always tend to see the glass half full for most things, but I tend to think that this makes so much common sense that eventually people are going to see that.
So what would be the role of my audience, investors, in that? I mean, either in a risk management sense or in a capital allocation sense. Do you have a view on what their role might be in that?
Right. That's an excellent question, because investors, particularly with a long-term perspective, are in a position to take into account the benefit of having insurance against a future shutdown of this one city in China. And therefore, investors with a long-term perspective have the incentive to invest in diversification. And therefore, they can be looking for either directly looking for potential firms in new countries, let's say, Cambodia or Ethiopia or Kenya, or they can be looking to support the effort of firms in the importing countries, say Germany or the US, who is looking for new partners, or they can be supporting intermediaries who would be doing this prospection and training on behalf of either the sellers or the buyers. So today it's done mostly by nonprofits supported by governments to kind of who plays this role of matchmaking between new firms and potential clients. But this is something that could totally be taken on as a for-profit project for someone that has enough long run in mind.
Esther, typically when we talk about poverty, it's in developing countries, which I think is obviously warranted. But yesterday we had fortunate enough to have Larry Summers also speak with us, and he was talking about one of the things he's really concerned about in the US is the growing inequality, and I guess as part of that is poverty as well. Do you have a view on developed countries and growing inequality and the country that you've now adopted as your home, the United States? Do you think that's an ongoing issue, and what can be done about it in the US?
So that is definitely an ongoing issue and was an ongoing issue before the pandemic. The inequalities have been growing in the US for decades and have reached a level that now even Larry Summers finds unsustainable. That is just both in terms of level and in terms of growth. You have the top 1% of the population owning a larger and larger share of the national income, while in real term wages of the bottom 50%, that's half of the population, have mainly remained stable. And what we have seen with the pandemic is that this has really put the spotlight on the consequences of that. So one thing that was true before, but few people knew, is that there is a huge impact of people's earnings on how long they live. And when the pandemic came, I think there was a moment where people thought of this as the great leveler because the virus doesn't play favorite and everybody can get it. And I think we soon realized that's just not true, because, for example, there are huge differences among racial groups. African Americans and Latinx population are much more affected. They are much more likely to be sick, and they are much more likely to die once they are sick. This is due to many reasons, but a lot of it have to do with both the deep inequality that exists in this country, as well as differential treatment at every stage, including in the hospital, which is a reflection of the racism that exists in this country. So I think this is not a small part of the reason why we have had this big protest movement in the US in the last few weeks. They were, of course, prompted by the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, but those also came, I think, on the heel of this absolutely unacceptable chiasm between the plight of African American and Latinx, who are literally keeping the economy going and are dying for it, and the rest of us.
Esther, we've got a question from one of our audience members, Marlene Puffer, who's the CEO and president of the Canadian National Railways Pension Fund. She's asking, what sort of innovative financing might be effective in supporting the diversification of the global supply chain into some of the poor countries that you mentioned? strong governance and oversight of employment practices are particularly challenging considerations?
That's a great question. I wish I had a more precise answer to the financing side per se. I think the key is to take into account, so to what makes it difficult, and I think that's what the question was partly related to. Three things makes it difficult. One is that every new country is a new set of things to learn. The regulation, how to navigate the landscape in the place. So every new country is kind of a new fixed cost to pay. And once this fixed cost is paid, it will benefit everyone. So nobody really wants to take the first step. The second point is this reputation effect that I mentioned, which is every new firm that you start in a new country, and every new country is a risk. There is a possibility that the relationship is not going to work out, and that possibility is larger if there is no track record with that country. So the financing needs to, for that reason, the financing needs to be long-term and needs to be very, very patient, and needs to find a way to be rewarded for the global benefit that are going to come from come from this development. Which is why I was thinking that either very large firms who can internalize some of these benefits, or a group that are acting on behalf of a collective, for example, industry association, are the right client for this exercise, and therefore could be then, trying and raising even bonds for doing that on behalf of the whole membership.
So I want to just address, Esther, your work and the work of your colleagues that you were recognised for in receiving the Nobel Prize. The committee said that your experimental research has transformed development economics. So you pioneered the use of randomised control trials to alleviate poverty, and you're now applying that to compare government communication strategies on public health at the Poverty Action Lab at MIT. Can you tell us a little bit about this application of your work and what some of the findings are so far?
So what we have described this Nobel Prize for, along with Michael Kremer and Abhijit Banerjee, is very much a Nobel Prize for a movement and not just for the three individual people. And that's really the movement of trying to improve policy making, the quality of the policies that reach the poor, by making sure that they are informed by scientific evidence. So concretely, what is the issue that we're trying to solve? The issue is that in many cases, people do, or governments do policies with no data and going with their intuition of what might work and might not work, and don't really evaluate what they do, so we never learned whether or not it was a good idea in the first place. And in many cases, those intuitions just, our intuition are just wrong. We can't really rely on our intuition to make policies. So our approach says, it's very simple and very practical. It says, look, start by breaking down the problem into many manageable issues. For example, how do you get kids to get immunized? Or how do you encourage people to wash their hands, especially in COVID times, or to wear a mask? Once you have one of these identifiable problems, try something out, but then experiment with it with the same way in which you would experiment for a drug. So we run what's called randomized control trials, where you have a treatment group which gets option A and a control group which gets option B. They are randomly selected, so there is nothing different across them, except that one get policy A and one get policy B, so we can really see whether A worked better than B. So since we started working with that, and this movement kind of got built around our work, literally thousands and thousands of those experiments have taken place, and we've learned many things, ranging from education to health to governance. So you wanted one example, and I'll give you the most recent example, a COVID-related example, because with COVID, everybody kind of pivoted to do work that is relevant to COVID. we just completed a study in West Bengal, India, where Abhijit Banerjee, my husband and a Nobel Prize winner, who has become quite well known in his native place, West Bengal, recorded some video messages to encourage people to report their symptoms to their local health workers, and also to wash their hands and to not travel too fast. And what we found is that, so we were able to send those videos to 25 million people in different villages. And what we found when we did that is that the people who got the video in the villages where we sent the video, there were twice as many, the local health worker reported twice as many symptoms being reported to them. So it had a huge impact on people reporting behavior, which is very, very important, because without knowing the status of the epidemic in a particular place, you cannot take appropriate measures to contain it. So that's an example of something that could be done very quickly and can inform policies, in the sense that this is a message that can now be spread from time to time for people to do this.
Esther, I've got another question from an audience member who's the Chief Investment Officer of Sura Asset Management in Colombia, Juan Camilo Osorio, who said most of the solutions he has heard of for reducing inequality in Latin America are about reducing the wealth of the richest and thus lowering inequality. Shouldn't it be to increase the wealth of the poorest? So what have you seen in this direction that may work for reducing inequality?
I agree with your question, Juan, that less attention is given to how to spend the money that we would be able to collect from increasing taxes or reducing inequality to effectively reduce poverty. And this is precisely what we are trying to do in our work, is to think of innovative measures to combat poverty. And sometimes they take more money, but in many cases, they also take a better usage of the money that already is there. There is precisely because the policymaking is not always informed by the best evidence. A lot of money is being wasted on programs that are not necessarily particularly effective. So one way to focus on one way to reduce poverty is to focus on what works. In Latin America, actually, we are lucky to have evidence on a very simple policy, which is to transfer money to the poor, cash transfers. In many countries in Latin America, they have implemented cash transfers that are tied to sending your kids to school or getting health visits for the children, etc. And those studies, starting with the Progressa study in Mexico, those programs have usually been evaluated with an RCT. There is one in Colombia, actually. And they have shown very positive effect that persists over time. So that would be a very natural place to start, to expand and make sure that this type of program exists, that they are run efficiently and they are run very on a widespread scale. And then there are many other things that have been tried in Latin America. So to improve the quality of education, for example, is important. To help small businesses become a bit less small, and so on and so forth.
There's another question here, this time from Ohio, and the School Employees Retirement System of Ohio Chief Investment Officer Faruqi Majid. If the World Bank, which has the goal of poverty alleviation, and foreign aid have not reduced poverty, how can pension funds who have no such expertise take on the goal of poverty alleviation as an SDG? Why not leave it to the experts? And it's related actually to a question that I had, which was, is there a role for large institutional investors to invest in, for example, fintech or emerging market debt, or are there other ways of sort of less indirectly but still trying to achieve that same goal of poverty alleviation? What is the role of pension funds and other large investors?
Many aspects of your question, so let me unpack it. So first of all, poverty has reduced. It's been halved since 1990. It's a huge success of the world. So we should not, in fact, everything has gone pear-shaped in the world even before COVID. Inequality is increasing. We have problems with climate change. Political conversations have become almost impossible in Western countries. Among these rather depressing geopolitical positions, the progress that has been done for the life of the very poor is actually an extremely bright spot. So that's the first. I would like to correct the premise there. However, I don't think it's the World Bank that did it. The World Bank played a role, but mostly what did it is a better focus in developing countries on improving the lives of the poorest. So I would take this as a success of the developing countries themselves. And of course, a lot of this is coming from China and India, who got no help at all and managed their own economies without needing any help from the World Bank or anyone else. Now, there is still poverty. And so the second question is, well, fine, then it's still the job of the government and the international institutions to try and fight it. Do pension funds have a role, and if so, what? I think a reasonable answer would be to say no, not particularly. You could say the pension funds have a role to be responsible investors and to make they play such an important role in the health of the economies in general, that's in a sense, just by carrying out your normal duty of investing responsibly, you are reducing poverty in a sense, or you are playing your part in reducing poverty. I will nevertheless not quite let you off so easily. There are two things that one can think about. The first one, especially for very large investors, is to think about how you're thinking about country credit risk. So, for example, in India, for the first few weeks after the pandemic, while the US was spending 10% of this GDP on a rescue package, India was spending less than 1%. And the reason that was given for not increasing the help, which was so critically needed, is that if they did that, that would require borrowing. And unlike the US and Europe, if India tries to borrow, the credit rating of India is going to fall. And then India won't be able to borrow anymore, or will borrow at larger rates. And there, I think pension funds, large institutional investors, play a key role in how you are reading what credit rating tell you. Because what sense would it make for the credit rating of India to fall? Because they are making the appropriate decision of borrowing in order to help their population weather this pandemic, which they need and the world need to avoid transferring this potentially temporary crisis into a permanent crisis via a multiplier demand shock. So I think everyone in the world would agree that the right thing to do for India was to spend 10% of their GDP like the US did. But the fact that they could not because they were concerned about the credit rating really makes me very concerned about the industry of credit rating, and makes me think that large investors need to be really active in how they process and read this, and thinking, does it make sense or does it not make sense? And in particular, what was the sensible thing to do for this country? Why should we punish them to do that when we are doing the same in the West? The second thing, and that's related to the fintech question, is socially responsible investment. In the previous session, the idea of greenwashing was mentioned. One thing that does worry me a lot is impact washing, which is sort of the new greenwashing. It's greenwashing 2.0. And there, I think there is so much progress to be made and there is something that can absolutely be driven by the research and economist arm of the institutional investors into thinking about how do we figure out what constitutes impact, social impact. How do we select investments that deliver true social impact and not just go with our intuition? I was saying before that one of the big changes in policy is that now many policymakers are willing to be much more pragmatic and following the evidence. I would say that the socially responsible investor world has not gotten there yet. Right now, if it looks good, if it's, someone is able to make the right pitch, people will go for it, especially if it affords a correct financial return. But what I'm seeing is sometimes some companies manage to have it both ways, because they're telling their investors, please accept a slightly lower return because I'm deliver impact. And they're telling us, the impact people, oh, I can't really have a rigorous evaluation of my impact because I also need to make money, so I cannot, be constrained by the. So you're telling one person, I can't deliver you money because I'm delivering impact, and you're telling the other person I can't get impact because I'm delivering money, and that I think is much more general than you would want. So from your position, the key is really to exercise scrutiny, not go for big words, follow the evidence, assess the social value of the investment with as much rigor as you assess the financial value of the investment, and you'll make huge progress.